Welcome back. We saw that we had an issue here where we need to create our Docker databases or our Postgres databases in Docker. And when we first did this on our machine, we had to open up pSQL and manually create this using the query table. And again, another reason we're using Docker is so that developers don't have to keep doing this over and over and over as they join the team. So let's build that out as part of the Docker build. I'm going to minimize this a little bit, and I'm going to go into our project folder and create a new folder. It's going to be called Postgres. And this video might be a little bit difficult, but it's a great setup that once you remember, then you can just repeat it on numerous projects, and just do it the way it is now. So you can always come back to this video. As long as you follow along and understand what we're trying to do, how we're connecting the dots, that's the important part. So I just created a Postgres folder. In here, we're going to create a new file, and it's going to be a Docker file. Now, this Docker file is going to now do something really interesting. Instead of Docker Compose, where we just had our image set up with no other build steps, we're actually going to customize this. I'm going to say that I want Postgres version 10.3, and this can be whatever you want it to be. And in here, I want to add a few files inside of the Docker container. I'm going to use the command add because I want to add the tables folder, which we're going to create in here, to the Docker, let's call it entry point init db. And this is going to be a .d file, tables. All right, what just happened here? This first file is saying that we want to create our users and login table. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to create a new folder in our Postgres folder called tables, which is referenced here. Now, within this tables folder, I'm going to have two files. I'm going to have the login table, which uses a .sql file type, and another table called users, which again uses the SQL file type. Now, the SQL file type, we just are able to write SQL commands inside of this. So if we go back to how we created our users table, and I just copy and paste this, I can just say create table users. You see I have some nice syntax. Again, ID of serial primary key. We have name that has variable character with limit of 100. Email that is a text type that has to be unique and cannot be null. We have entries that is big integer, that is it can go up pretty high in number, and the default is going to be 0. So when the first register, they're going to be 0. And then our joined timestamp not null. These are just basic SQL commands to create a table. It's something that you can look over and really depends on each situation. Now, another good practice when you're working with SQL files is to do something called transactions. That is to make sure that this transaction completes and it doesn't half fill the users table, or we want to make sure that these things are what we call atomic. That is, if this fails or part of it fails, then just don't bother creating the users table at all because that's just going to mess things up. So the syntax for this is to say begin transaction. And again, this is just good practice and the syntax that you have to get used to. Ooh, and make sure I spell that right. Begin transaction. And then finally, at the end of the transaction, we say commit, as in, yes, commit those create table changes. So we have our users table. If we go back, let's grab our login table as well. If I go back to my history, I don't have the history, so we'll have to write it all by hand. Again, as we remember, begin transaction we want to create table login. And this login table, oops, that's not what we wanted to do. Let's go back. Circular brackets is going to have an ID of, again, serial primary key. It's going to have a hash of variable character 100, and it cannot be null. And then finally, it's going to have the email that is of text. It has to be unique, and it's not null. And we don't need the comma here. Finally, semicolon, and we want to commit this. All right, so we've just created 2 SQL files, but they're not really doing anything right now, are they? Luckily for us, there is another SQL file that we can use. And this one, we're just going to put at the root of the Postgres folder, and I'm going to call it deploy schemas, because these are schemas that we're deploying. And again, it's going to be a .SQL file. Now within here, I can comment and just say that this is deploy fresh database tables. Now in here, we're going to do \i, and this is going to run the new file that we're going to create. Now, in here, in our Docker file, remember how we said add the table folder that we just created? Oh, and it's tables, so make sure I say tables here, to the docker entry .d at table. So this is the folder we're going to create on our container. I can actually just copy this, go back to the deploy schema, and say run the tables, that is the use, and let's run the users.sql table. Because in the Docker compose file, or the Docker file, we're moving whatever's in the tables, which is login and users, to this tables thing. So the deploy is simply saying, run this SQL command we just created, which again is the users table. And we can do the same for the login table. All right. Now we have the tables, we have the deploy. The last thing we need to do is actually run this file in the container. And the way we call this is, once again, in the Docker file, we add another line saying add. And this time, because we're just adding the deploy schema SQL, I'm going to say deploy schemas.sql into the main folder, like this. Now, let's save and see if there's any errors as we run this. I'm going to close down everything, run Docker Compose down, and then go with Docker Compose up build. All right, if you actually see up here, you see that, there's create database call that was made. All right, so let's see if it actually works now. If I go back to my app, so let's give it another go here. Let's see if we can register now. We have bad request. Let's see what we got wrong here. And again, we have to think about what we're doing. If we go to Docker Compose, remember how we're just building the Postgres from image? And we don't want to do that anymore. We have a Docker file. And remember, anytime we need to use a Docker file, we want to run build. So instead of image, I can say build. And what do we want to build? We want to build whatever's inside of Postgres. So whatever Docker file is at the root of Postgres. In our case, we can just write it like this. Let's save this. Again, bring the service down. Oh, and make sure that I add the dot here. And come on, back up. All right, let's make the output a little bit bigger. And if we scroll up, look at that. In our Postgres output, we have create role, create database, but also begin, because remember, we began a transaction, we created a table, we committed. Another transaction that created another table. So it looks like everything is running. The databases were created. If I go back again and rerun this, let's open up the terminal. Make sure that we don't get any errors. Clear this. And I'm going to hit register. Woohoo! We just registered and we have Tim in here, and let's just add a image here. Let's go with whatever face we can find. Or let's use this one. Look at that. Our SmartBrain app is finally working. It's the exact same thing as we've done before. Nothing's changed on the front end, but oh boy, has a lot changed on the back end. We now have all this amazing logging, but Postgres and backend are running inside of the same command. Not only do we not have to worry about setting up a table, making sure that a developer has Postgres installed on their computer, the right node version on their computer. All they had to do was simply run this command, docker compose up build, and our entire backend system was just like that, already set up. Now, the beauty with this is that because we run docker up build all the time, it takes time, right? But you actually, once you build it once and there's no changes that you want to make, you can just run docker compose up. And it's a lot faster this way. It doesn't rebuild everything from the Docker file. Very cool. I hope you're excited as I am about Docker. There's one last thing I want to add, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.